Hello, everyone. Welcome to Automation Hour. This is our last session for the year, so thanks for joining us. If you are joining us for the first time, all lines will be muted. Please post any questions that you have on our Trailblazer Community Salesforce Automation Hour, or you can also use the question section in the GoToWebinar. We will be posting a link to the recording as well as the deck sometime after the session. And as I mentioned, this is our last session for this year. We are booked out through mid-June of next year. So if you haven't registered already, I encourage you to register. Even if you can't attend live, you'll get the link to the recording after the fact. We're really excited to have some first-time presenters coming and some repeat presenters as well. And we can't bring this free webinar series to you without our sponsor, Concrete.io. So thank you for your continuing support of us. And here are your co-hosts, myself, Rakesh, and David. And I am very excited to have Michael Barnes come back to present. He's presented a couple of times for us, and looking forward to the information that he's going to be sharing with us today. So with that, let me hand over controls to Michael. And you should have control now.
Okay, so how do I share my screen here? Just gotta.
So under the sharing.
Oh, the sharing tab, that would make sense. All right, here we go. Go ahead and show my screen and let me know when you see it here. Go ahead.
It's saying waiting to view.
Oh, there it is.
There you go. I see the slide deck
now.
now.
All right. Sorry about the delay there. My internet is being a little bit slow today, so I do apologize for that. So my name is Michael Barnes. I'm with GolfNow. We're the largest distributor of tee times in the world. We're a worldwide company based here in Orlando, Florida, and have offices in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and also in Australia. And we have sales agents all throughout the country and the world. But a little about me, I'm the director of Salesforce.com administration for GolfNow since 2013. Started with Salesforce back in 2010 at my prior company, and really loved that part of my job. I was able to launch Salesforce there, not knowing a lot about Salesforce at the time, and just found that I could say yes to a lot of questions as far as, hey, can Salesforce do this? The answer was often yes. So I really fell in love with what I could do with Salesforce, found a full-time job doing Salesforce, so here I am. Started out in engineering, earned an MBA, and then here I am doing Salesforce. Spoken at Dreamforce multiple years, as well as Automation Hour for Jennifer and her team. Certified admin, and earned my Ranger certification finally this year. That's something I just haven't had as much time to focus on as I would like to have had, but do plan on doing more of that into next year, and also on a path to my goal for the next year is to at least get significantly move toward getting a technical architect certification. So got a lot to do to get there. Just a little more about GolfNow. Again, if you play golf, you might be interested in our GolfNow app, or the Golf Pass is a program we sell. But we're also recently reorganized under NBC Sports digital products. So NBC Sports is GolfNow is one of their main digital products. Sports Engine's another one. So we're all kind of one digital business underneath NBC Sports. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Salesforce Limits. So even if you have Unlimited Edition, if anybody of you on the call has Unlimited, you'd be like, oh, that's great, Unlimited Edition. I've moved up, from whatever professional, whatever you had before, but you find out, no, there's still limits with Salesforce, and there's limits for a number of reasons. But no matter what edition you have, you're going to have limits. And what I'd like to talk about is some of the best practices that, even if you don't hit limits, there's some best practices for just making your implementation make sense, so that you don't drive your own self crazy, but there are some limits that you're going to hit if you're not careful, and you want to make scalable tools, scalable processes for your teams. And if you're not paying attention to those limits and what Salesforce can handle, then you can sometimes have slow running processes. You can run into errors and things like that. So I'm going to talk about just a few different areas: workflow rules and what limits you have there, process builder, flow, scheduled actions, lookup relationship limits. Then I'll talk a little about record types and permission sets and profiles versus profiles if I have time. Just more best practices around these last couple things. So let's go ahead and I'll jump in to workflow rules. So one thing with the workflow rules, even if you'll find that there are limits on how many workflow rules that you can have per org. So that's something you might not realize right away. And this is actually our org. We have a lot of business logic in our org. You'll see here that you can see how many workflow rules you have. You can see I use a lot of workflow rules historically. Have a lot. You can also see we have how many flows. We have a lot of flows, 731 flows. So you can see there's a lot going on in our org as far as automation. You can see that our code used pretty light. We don't have a lot. 10% of our code base has been used. The 6 million characters we're allowed to have in our org. So we are heavily using the automation tools available to us, but there is a limit on how many things you can have. And previously with flows, which includes process builder, by the way, if you have process builder, the number of flows includes how many processes you have running in process builder. So one way that you can eliminate a issue like I have here, which is hitting 71% of the total workflow rules we're allowed to have, is to use process builder instead. So process builder can do everything that a workflow rule can do, but you can do multiple decision elements within a process builder. That workflow rules, you can only do one decision element per workflow rule. So that's really the big difference between those technologies. And so you can only have so many workflow rules per object. So if you are, if you create, in our case, we have case object that has a lot of workflow rules tied to it. I've actually hit the limit on our case object, and it will, drive you crazy. You're like, oh, I need to add another one. Well, sometimes it's, there's cleanup that's required. There's, technical debt that you're going to run into where, over time, in an org like ours, which is very mature, our org was founded in 2005, but you can find that information here in company information. You can always take a look and see, how long when your org was created. Ours comes back to October 2005. So very old org. But these are just great places to look. If you're not sure where, where you stand now in your org, make sure you're familiar with your company information. We'll tell you some things. A lot of user license information is there. And system overview will also tell you some of the same information, as well as where you are in workflow rule limits and, your code usage and things like that. So very good to be up to speed on those things. But workflow rules are great because they're easy to use and they always work. In my experience, you can't really break a workflow rule. It's really hard to do that. But one of the things about workflow rules is the reason that they always work is they're not subject to the validation rules that you set on your objects. So if you create a validation rule on an account that says, that the account name can't be XYZ, but if you have a workflow rule, update the account name to XYZ, it'll go through no problem. If the user tries to create an account with an account name XYZ, they'll get an error. So it's the UI only. Those validation rules are really UI only when relative to workflow rules. When workflow rule runs, they bypass your standard validation. The standard validation rules you create as a user. Now they are subject to still Salesforce validation, which there's more back-end validation things that Salesforce does. Still subject to that, but not subject to your validation rules. Whereas Process Builder and Flow, if you create processes there, they are subject to your validation rules. So again, I'll just move this out of the way so I can see what I'm doing. I'll just pull up, actually I'll use the case objects. That one has a lot of stuff going on it. So you can see that you can create many validation rules, and if you're not paying attention when you build a process with Process Builder or your Flow, you can cause your users to get ugly errors. Sometimes they won't give you much information if you're the user on the user end. So it's very important to be very careful when you're creating Process Builder in Flow that you pay attention, you test, of course, but also just be aware of the validation rules you have in place, because they could get tripped up, especially if your tests don't, confirm or run every potential scenario that may hit those validation rules. You may miss something, and then in which case you have to put some kind of skip through. So in that way, one of the ways I can make Process Builder or Flow, work more like a workflow rule in that sense is create a bypass field. You can just create in your object, any object, whether it's custom object or standard object, create a field called bypass validation, right? Make it a Boolean field, checkbox field, true or false. And when you start, and Process Builder can still have the decision element, but then you have to run your action inside Flow, your update, whatever you're doing to your record, if you want to bypass the validation that maybe you're hitting. So you can check a box called, at the beginning of the flow, update your record, bypass flow to true, do whatever you're going to do, and then at the end of the flow, do an update of your record that sets the bypass validation to false. And then in your validation rule, you can just add a criteria for each of your validations that you'd like to bypass in that scenario, to set that bypass validation must be equal to false in order for that validation rule to be tripped. So I know something else to be aware of, validation rules. If you're here in the object manager and you are on your object and you choose a validation rule, I believe it should tell us here that your validation rule must be set to, must yield a true statement. So it should tell us here momentarily. That's the case, but your validation rule here the error condition is when this formula or whatever you put into your validation rule must return true in order for the error message to be displayed and for nothing to happen, with your record on save. Whereas in Flow, if you're in a flow, if you have a page level validation, that the formula you create must be equal to false. Otherwise, you will see the error message that you put. So I know it's Salesforce, the same company, same product, but in Flow, the validation rule must be set to false in order to bypass, in order to not see the error message. Versus this must be false to not see the error message, right? So true sees the error message here, false sees the error message in Flow. So anyhow, that's just a little tidbit on, or make sure you're paying attention to validation rules. In Process Builder, one of the things that you might want to consider is always making one process per object. Now that's a good best practice if you can get away with it. It's not always feasible. Sometimes you have to have and again, there's not a limit. You can have as many processes as you want per object. At least I haven't hit a limit on that yet. But though, again, as a best practice, just because there's not a limit doesn't mean you shouldn't try to stick to one process. You can create quite a few decision elements in a single process. Now, one thing I have discovered, though, in Process Builder is if you have a very large process, it will get slower every time you try to save it. And of course, every time, more automation you add, it may make saves and other things run a little slower. But one thing in Process Builder that may prevent you from creating just one per object is if you have time delay elements. So if you create a time delay, which in your process, you can, you'll see that there's this element. Let's see if I have one here that you can see. I'm going to the next object, can't see any on here, but you have immediate actions, and then depending on your process, you may also have time delay actions. So that the time delay actions are helpful, especially if you're hitting limits. Sometimes you'll try to make your Process Builder do too much. Again, I've done this many times. So this all comes from personal experience where I've created a number of processes. They're doing a lot of different updates in a lot of different places, and I have to call a lot of flows to do some lookups of information and a lot of complex decisions, and Process Builder has a pretty basic decision element is either true or false. You only have two outcomes, whereas Flow you have many potential outcomes in a flow, and you can do a lot more complex logic in Flow. So quite often Process Builder will kick off a flow, but the challenge with with that is if I try to do too much, I'm trying to look up too much, or I'm trying to do too many updates, you can hit SOQL query limits. So SOQL query is when, Salesforce is trying to look up information in the Salesforce database, in your objects, try to pull back records. And if you try to do too many queries of the database, that's one of the big things that Salesforce will fail on, especially with relative to Process Builder and Flow. So to avoid those limits, quite often it does make sense to add the time delay action. Instead of doing something immediately, put it on a time delay if it doesn't have to be done right away, especially flows that maybe create some other records. They don't need to be created instantaneously, but they need to be created eventually and soon. So you can do a 0-hour delay on your time delay action. And what that'll do is it'll actually, instead of running immediately as part of that transaction, it will run as a separate transaction asynchronously with the save. So you won't cause your users to experience an error because you're trying to do too much. Instead, the request will get queued into this Salesforce, and Salesforce is much happier to run things on a delay because they get to run it when it's best for Salesforce, and the Salesforce system has time to run that request. And the Salesforce system can run a lot of requests, so you don't have to worry about it being delayed a long time. It may be at most a minute or two before you'll see the update on your record, but usually it's within seconds, even with an asynchronous save like that. So that's, again, something I find. Now, the only downside with that is if you have a process that's, and this one's not a good example here at the top, or if you're evaluating X criteria, because that's a nice thing that allows us to create numerous decisions within a single process, because you can evaluate the next criteria. That only works, though, if you're doing immediate actions. As soon as you do a time delay action, that's the last one you can evaluate the next criteria on. Now, you can always, as long as things are mutually exclusive, maybe that's okay. You have to really think through your logic as far as, is it okay if I have a time delay on this one? If I don't, and if I hit this one, it's okay if I never get to this one, because this one has a time, this one has a time delay action instead of being able to evaluate the next criteria. As soon as you have a time delay, that does, and kind of, for me, it typically ends my process. I'll usually try to push those to the end of the process if I have a lot, but if I have more than one item that needs to have time delay, quite often I do end up with a second process. So you can create very long processes that have a lot of information all inside of all a lot of decision elements all inside of one process. That way, it also keeps all your stuff in one place. So if you can get away with it, it's it'd be good to put especially if you're new. If I was new to Salesforce, I'd probably try to do everything in Process Builder, not even use workflow rules if I could avoid them, simply because it keeps everything in one place, and I don't have to go hunting for what's causing this to change on my such record. Okay, well, I can go see it right here in Process Builder. So let me see what's next on my agenda here. So next thing is, so I mentioned that calling flows is the most likely reason you'll hit an unhandled fault error. So I mentioned, and instead of trying to do everything at once, break things up into separate processes. So the flows can get very complex if you allow them to. Over time, they will keep getting bolted on and changed. But if you can break things up and do things in different processes instead of all in one, that's also been a best practice for me as well. So I mentioned this already, so let's see. Just looking at my notes. So one thing about Flow, which is nice, and I'll go ahead and jump into Flow because it is one of my favorite tools of all time. Process Builder is a great engine for calling Flow. Of course, Flow has more options now. It used to be Flow. Well, initially, it could only be a screen flow. You could create a button maybe to call that flow, and then of course they add the ability for Process Builder to call flows, which is great. And then more recently, you'll have multiple options in your flow. If you're when you go to start one, you get all these choices now, which is really great. So you can, first, your screen flow, the original, still there. The auto launch flow, which you need that to call from flow like that to call from Process Builder. But now you have a few different other choices here. You can schedule a flow to run on a. So instead of having to write some Apex actually to run a scheduled job, Flow can now run on a schedule, which is really awesome. So I have some things that run, every day or every week, depending on what I need it to do. And then you also have the record triggered flows. So based on, you can basically set a rule that says, hey, if this record's created or updated or deleted, which is also a nice thing that you can do now, you can run a flow that does maybe some other actions. And then the platform event triggered flow, frankly, I haven't used that one yet, but there are some options that you can look into that as well. But I find that in my flows, one of the things that's been great and has just been a best practice I wanted to share, because just because you can do it doesn't mean you should, right? That's the kind of the lesson of this talk today. And again, this is just coming off my personal experience. But one of the nice things about if you do like a get element now in Flow is, and I search in here and I just want to pull my account object up. And one of the things that's really great is you can just say, one of my best practices, again, for keeping things simple and avoiding issues with Flow is to, come in here and say, I want my, let's see, better just type in the whole thing, account ID. Too many fields in my account object. So I got account ID equals, and I typically will set this to a input variable. If I'm assuming that the account is what's going to cause this flow to be called, change to the account. So I'm going to say this is account ID, and I always do this. I know it's a variable type, and this is just text because this is what I'm passing in, and you have to make sure we set this to an input variable. But what's really great about Flow now that this has been improved, the default is awesome. So you don't used to be your choice was choose fields and assign variables. That was kind of the default. You'd have to choose which fields, object you were, getting, and then define all the variables for every field you're pulling in. That was quite a bear. So Salesforce has really made it easy on us now, where you just say, you can say we want one or many records. So it's automatically, and then you say automatically store all the fields. That's great. And it automatically creates I have to name this thing, otherwise it's not going to go on. So we'll just say test. And what the great thing about this now is this has created a record variable for us. So I don't have to worry about creating variables. It used to be, flows, again, not really a limit on how many things you can have, but it can get out of control having to create all these variables and all these, create record variables on your own the old way. Now it creates record variables for you. And I haven't really run into any issues. Again, with my account object is pretty heavy. It has a little too much in it, something we're working on scaling back on it where we can. But the nice thing is now I can access this record variable elsewhere in my flow, and I can access all the fields that are on my account record, based on the input, ID that I pass through. And again, the reason I like to do this is especially if I'm trying to debug. I won't do this now, but when you have this saved and you want to debug, you could pass in, in process builder, you can pass an entire record in, and it would pass in basically a record variable directly. I could create a record variable and have that passed in. I find the challenge with that is then debugging, because you can't debug directly. The debug won't work without an input ID. So my experience is just pass the ID only in, then just do immediate lookup of the record, get the same effect as you end up with your single variable, with your record variable, with all the fields available from that object that started the flow. And then from there, I can do whatever I need to do. I can do decisions based on information in this record. I can do decisions, I can then look up other information based on this record, on other objects perhaps, and continue on. So again, just I just find that sticking to the basics of what Flow can do has really helped make my flows much less complex and easier to work with. So, okay, so look at my notes, and so I was saying also the best to create or update is to make sure your record variables null. Okay, so yeah, one of the things I like to make sure of, this is again where you're going to hit an issue, is if let's say I'm trying to look up a record that's related to this. So sometimes you'll know you have a relationship that exists if, let's see, let's do an assignment here and say I was trying to, let's do decision, yeah, decision. So I might know that there's a certain field that's definitely populated, but I might not. So on my account, if I have, if there's in my case, account is, has a bunch of different relationship fields, no real parent. I mean, there could be a parent, a parent account on it, but that may or may not, that's a good example. So if a parent account is or is not set. So if I come here, I see I have a parent account, I could just grab fields right from the parent account. Now the problem is if I start doing this and I click on parent account and I go ahead and from here I can just say, I just want to know the name of the parent account. And sure, I could pass this through and say, based on the parent account name is X. The problem is if the parent is not populated on this account, this may fail. So it's a good idea anytime you're going to use a downstream variable, just because again, they let you get to these things doesn't mean it's always going to work. You have to know if that record is populated, if that value is populated in a lookup relationship. So in this case, I'm going to first, before I do that, do any decisions, based on that record information directly, I could say, well, at least make sure that the parent is not null. That's always a good idea. So again, I can access all the variables on this account, but just because all the variables are available doesn't mean they're all populated. And if they're not populated, then that's, you're going to end up with some issues down the line. So again, instead of just saying parent account, I should come down here and say, well, let's make sure the parent ID has something in it first. So you can say parent ID is null and set this to false. So and now I can check, now because I'm checking this and I'm leaving this as an and statement, now I can check to see, well, as long as this is not, as long as this is null as false, I mean, this is populated, it has something in there, then I know that, perhaps then the name field will definitely be populated because I know the name is always populated on an account record. So the parent account is just another account record. So I can feel more comfortable saying, go ahead and grab the parent name and check to see if it's this. So just again, another little example of, it's where you're going to have some limits where it looks like Salesforce has access, man, to everything. I can just look it up and just go, with all these relationships that are great. And this is a really great thing that Salesforce has given us access to, but you have to put some, there's caveats, right? You have to put some checks on your own to make sure that there's information in there. Otherwise, you're going to get errors like, hey, the value is not, of this variable is not set. If a value of variable is not set, its flows don't like that. Flows say, no, we're not going to continue on without that information. So, all right. So let's see here. So on my, talk about that. Let's see, flows. Okay, and assignment variable remote limits. Okay. So let's see. So, so one thing another thing, I'll just go ahead and, if you have any more questions on flow, flow is again one of my favorite tools. Please put it in the chat. I'm going to move on to some other things that I'll be happy to answer at any point in time. Actually, if there's any question, anything now, Jennifer, that I should answer on flow or process builder, it's probably a good time to do that. But if there's not, then I'll just keep going on. All right.
Sorry, I was coming off mute. We do have some questions. All right, sure. So let me go to them. Jim asks, I'm new to the ecosystem and I've worked on workflow and was told that workflow does a robust job updating fields. Was advised to use workflow for this. That contradicts Michael's advice to avoid workflow. Also, process builder seems to be going away and emphasis is on flow. That once again contradicts Michael's advice to use process builder.
Well, is process builder going away? I've not heard that it's going away, but I could see that they might be moving eventually, converting all of our processes into flows, basically into some kind of triggered flow.
The end goal is the Salesforce automation team is pushing to have process builder be the one automation tool versus having all these different automation tools out there. So sure. At this point, they are trying, what you'll see in the releases is enhancements are going to flow builder, not process builder, not workflow rules. There's no sunset date yet, like there's no sunset date for workflow rules, but as they provide more functionality to flows, you should look to build in Flow Builder versus Process Builder in workflow
Gotcha.
rules.
So, and that said, you cannot replace Flow cannot do everything Process Builder can do yet in this. So Process can do everything that Workflow can do. I've not found anything that Workflow Rule can do that Process Builder can't. Again, there's some differences in how it runs those rules, and you have to be more careful in Process Builder. If Workflow Rule is great. I mean, I got started with just when that was the only thing that was available, and they are solid. They always do run. That is definitely the benefit of using them. If you don't have a lot of them, maybe it's not a problem. But as Jennifer said, if Workflow Rules is not the future, that there's nothing new coming to Workflow Rule. Process Builder, if I was new to the ecosystem, I would come in and I would definitely learn Process Builder, because that and Flow. So Process Builder, frankly, on the back end, I've trying to troubleshoot some things. I've actually hacked some IDs into the URL and ended up in a what looked like a flow, but was actually Process Builder. So Process Builder is really just flow on the back end. So I could completely see at some point Process Builder being converted into flows. So I don't think you're going to be in any trouble using Process Builder. And Process Builder is necessary to do some of the the core decisions, so that if you should run or not. Even triggered flows, you can't do a lot of decisions. You can't do like an is updated or is changed, for example. So if I wanted to do was this field changed, so then I should run this flow. I can't. I don't. Unless I'm missing something. I have not seen where you can do that in a triggered flow yet. But yeah, I can see that definitely coming, and then everything would just be inside Flow. That'd be great. I definitely would learn Flow. That sounds like that's definitely where everything is going. Process Builder is just a different UI that's actually built on the back end is building flows. If you dig deep enough, you'll find that.
Why don't we have a bunch of questions, but they're general automation questions. So why don't we continue on with your presentation, and then we'll take those at the end.
Sure. Absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and change pace or change the tack here a little bit. And then again, I'll be happy to answer all the other questions at the end that I can. One thing that Salesforce does have some limits on is going to be on lookup relationships. So this is something I've hit recently, and there's other limits. I mean, there's limits on how many fields you can have per object. Just don't create a ton of fields per object. Create secondary objects. I typically will create a custom object and create a relationship to the primary record wherever I can to avoid gumming up, especially my core primary objects like case and opportunity and account. You can only fit so much in those objects, and everybody wants to have their account field, their case field. But I find that for certain processes, it makes a lot of sense to break those out. But one of the places where I've really run into some issues recently is lookup relationships, because everybody wants their lookup relationship on their record. So on my, actually one of the objects where I know this limit has been hit recently, actually both my account and my order object, where folks wanted they wanted to have a relationship to not only the opportunity, we have multiple opportunities in our business, and they wanted to have a relationship to every opportunity that was part of that order, and that just wasn't working out. So we hit the limit, right? We created, started out with just a couple, 2, 3, 4, 5. Next thing you know, you're at a lot of, I can't remember what the limit is here, but you can always find your limits, by the way, for object level limits at object limits. So you'll see here that we have total lookup relationships, so it should be down here somewhere. And you see have total workflow rules. Hitting, I got 114 out of 500 allowed. And if you hit 500, you won't be allowed to add any more. Roll-up summary fields, that's a place where I've hit limits in the past. Very helpful fields, but you can only have so many on an object. But there's my custom relationships. This is one I've hit more recently, and you can see I have my custom fields. Oh my gosh. So we've got a lot of fields, a lot of relationships. Doesn't always work out. So creating custom objects instead, and in the case of the custom relationship field, what I have done is create a custom object to do the join. So if you create a custom object that has 2 master detailer relationships, it's effectively called a join object. So it basically creates a many-to-many relationship between the 2 objects that you tie it to. And that's how Salesforce handles those many-to-many relationships. So if I need to have an order or potentially many orders potentially tied to many opportunities, then creating a join object is how I have solved for that problem to avoid, this relationship. So I told folks, hey, we can't add any more custom relationship fields. I can't meet what you're asking me to do directly on this object, which is where you want it because you want your reporting to be easy. I know, but we got to find another way. So creating the join object has solved that for us in lieu of trying to get limits extended and things like that. But 40 is some of these limits Salesforce will extend, and some they won't. So I know the roll-up summary fields, I know it was lower at one point in the past. We did have them extend that because we wanted more and more roll-ups, namely on the account object in our org. But we found that we had to scale that back because you have to find other ways to solve those problems. So I create, so I mentioned custom objects. And then what's nice also about the custom object when you do the join is you can create other attributes on the join that would not be feasible potentially. You could have notes. You could say, well, hey, why are we joining these two fields? Well, if you have just a lookup relationship, there's hard to put notes and say why. I mean, you could put general notes on the object, but that gets busy, and you have multiple relationships. You could add another field, for each of those, and then you have even more fields on your object. Whereas a custom object, you can add just a few different attributes around that join. You can actually do formulas to look up values from each of those objects, so you can get all your reporting that you need in one place. Or you don't even have to create custom. You can just create custom report types, and then grab all the fields you need from each of the child objects, or each of the parent objects, I should say, and then display everything you need in your reporting. So there are a lot of great ways around those limits, around, and then you get more out of it, which is what I'm trying to get at. You get more by having a join object with the two master detailed relationships. You end up with more information at the end of the day. So in that case, this is what I've built. I'll show you real quick. It's the actually I'll do one here. It's called revenue allocation. This is an interesting one where I did have a lot of different attributes. So this was one where they wanted to join. We have a opportunity and a payment record, because we keep our payment records separate from our opportunities, because we have a bunch of different attributes. We store our payments, and then we had our opportunity. Well, we have that. This is just basically a join object. You'll see there are two master details. We have an opportunity detail relationship, and we have a payment master detail relationship. But then there's a bunch of formulas on here because I wanted to have access to be able to show these things in a list view easily. And then there's some other information. I got some sales order date, start date, some other information that we want to track just on this record alone. So that's on the join record. So it gives me more information, allows me again to join many records and avoid hitting limits on either of the objects which I'm joining. All right, let's see. And so record types. So this is another item I wanted to talk about. And with record types, I use record types a lot. And you have to have one of the higher, and you can't, if a starter or a lower, I'm not even sure what the different levels are. With unlimited, you definitely can have record types, but some of the versions of Salesforce don't have record types available. But record types gives you two main things, two useful purposes. They allow you to set pick list values specific to that record type. So if you have a pick list on your object, that record type can have different values than another record type using the same field. So it keeps you from having to create two different fields for two different purposes. You create one field, put all your choices in there, and then you define which choices are available at each record type. The next thing that it really helps out with is page layouts. You'll see there's a page layout assignment available. Now, of course, with this allocation object, I don't have any record types, but if you wanted to have different page layouts based on different profiles, you can, of course, you could do that out of the box under page layouts, but you can also have different page layouts based on record type. So based on and that to me is even more useful because it's based on the record type we're looking at. I may want to show different types of fields. It could be a different process based on the different record type. And that's the only time I want to use record types is if I have a use case for those things. So again, I haven't hit a limit yet on how many record types you can have. I'm sure there probably is one, but record types are special. It's a special field. It has its own object where all the information is stored around that record type, and it gives you those two things, those two attributes that are around your records. That's really helpful. One thing that's kind of bit me in the butt around it is if I expose the record type to my users, they then want more record types because they start seeing it as an attribute. I would highly recommend not using record types as attributes, just again, from my experience, that because you don't want your record types to get out of control. Then you end up having to maintain a lot of different record types, potentially a bunch of different, your page layout assignments can get out of control with the many, many record types. Best to use, a type field, some other pick list field as your attribute, and keep the record type hidden as much as possible. So the way, again, I do that, I use flow quite often. If they're trying to create a new record, the user's trying to create a new record, instead of exposing the record type, I'll ask them some information about the record they're building. It's probably going to be another attribute field that, this attribute field, I could have 10 choices in the attribute field, but there's only 2 different record types or 3 different record types. And I will say, well, based on the attribute you chose, I know which record type you need, or based on this group of attributes, maybe I do a decision element in my flow to set the record type. So this is, again, to avoid, you don't want your record types to get out of control. Not that there's any limit, but it can cause you'll hit your own personal limits on those real quick if you let them get out of control. Let's see. So I guess I'll use this. I mentioned all that standard pick list field. Similarly is custom profiles. So you have an option. You're in Salesforce. You get some standard profiles out of the box, which frankly we use almost none of them. The only one I think we use is the administrator profile, since you kind of have to use the administrator profile, and administrator has access to everything. But we create custom profiles for different teams that need access to different parts of Salesforce, so we don't have to give everybody access to everything. So group profiles are great for that, but they're great for general access, and you do need them for page layout access. Profiles are still in use even in Lightning page access levels. So it's important to have your users grouped and understand which page layouts they need to see, and set profiles according to those groupings of users. But where you can run into trouble with profiles and where it can get out of control is if you have, different users have they're on a large team, but one user needs some specific needs. They need to have cross access over to what another team also has on their profile. So that's where permission sets come in. Permission sets are a way to assign a group of, it's basically a mini profile, if you think about it that way, that you can you have limited targeted access within Salesforce, and you can assign those permission sets to individual specific users. So really finding permission sets to be really helpful. There's also ways to set permission sets that restrict access, which is something that's relatively new. Previously, anytime you give people access, they get the benefit of access to whatever, they basically, you can only, and generally in Salesforce, you give people access somewhere that you can only basically flip the switch on. Doesn't matter where the switch gets flipped on, they're going to get access to it. So it could be at the permission set level, it could be at profile level, it could be at a sharing rule level or something like that. So the profiles, basically are the base access level. You have to have access to a specific record, let's say. So sure, you can try to share stuff with somebody all day long, but if they don't have read access on that object, they're not going to be able to see anything. But they can get it via profile or permission set. So you don't have to give everybody in that profile access, and you don't have to clone the profile and try to create, you imagine how the iterations could go if you start trying to create custom profiles for individual users. Highly recommend avoiding that wherever you can. Again, not that there's limits there, but it's a limit that you'll want to, create for yourself. Hey, I'm only going to create this. We only have this many, functional teams in our business. I'm going to create, core profiles for each of these functional teams that have access to the objects in Salesforce that they need to see. And then, hey, for the people that are, maybe changing teams or are working across a couple different teams, they will get a permission set, maybe indefinitely, or maybe for a certain period of time while they go get temporary access to another part of Salesforce. And then, I can create a process to make sure I go to remind myself to turn that off later when we know that they're transitioned or done with that project. So that's basically everything I had to share today. I just wanted to share with you again the different limits that Salesforce has, at a high level, least limits that have caused me issues. I bring all this up because these are limits that I have hit on my own, and so it comes from personal experience. I've been doing Salesforce for 10 years, made a lot of mistakes over the years, just learning the hard way quite often. And but listening to folks, in sessions like these has really helped me to, key in on some tidbits that over the years have, I think, made me a much better admin. So thank you all for listening today. I appreciate it. And I'll be happy to answer any other questions.
All right, as a reminder, if you have questions, you can post them in the questions section and go to webinar, or you can post them out on our Trailblazer community, Salesforce Automation Hour. So moving on to the questions, have one from Cassandra. How do you like the auto layout? So this is on flows. I found that if I wanted to add a loop to an existing flow, I can't adjust the loop to incorporate the items after the loop, so I have to rewrite. Also, if you are not using auto layout, how do you add the end button? Is it necessary to add the end button?
Oh,
And
good questions. So first,
and she has a
I
follow-up
hate the
also.
auto layout.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes. No, go ahead.
Okay, so the auto layout, I don't like it. I mean, it is handy if you're making a very basic flow. So I can, put this in here. The end is not necessary. I'll show you what that is. The end is basically anywhere the flow terminates and doesn't go on. So the nice thing about the auto layout is it does at least let you know, hey, if you go down this path, your flow is going to end. If you don't do anything else, your flow is going to end. So it's especially if you're newer to flow, it's probably a really great way to learn flow. After you get used to using flow, and as you mentioned, making loops and doing other more complex, making complex flows, it gets tedious. I find trying to use this layout. So I agree using this. So if I do this, so this is something you have to be careful of though, because I've made the mistake, when I'm using this free-form editor, and I'll create, a bunch of outcomes. If I have it, let's say I do a decision element, and don't go ahead and build it right now. But if I do a decision element and I have four outcomes, but only 3 of them are tied off, then the fourth one's if I hit that fourth one, it's going to end my flow. So basically, anytime you get to a point in your flow that has nowhere else to go, if you meet the criteria of a decision element, or I hit the last element in a flow, it's going to end.
Okay. And her other question is, can you also show how you could merge paths on a non-auto layout? Also, I wanted to mention, I love the ability to copy and paste elements in the flow in auto layouts.
Yeah, so you can copy and paste elements in standard layout too. So I'll show that. I'm just trying to leave this flow because this one's, let's see, I'll go into another flow. I'll go into an existing flow. This is one I just created today. So let's take a look at it. I'm creating flows like every day. I love these things. That's why I have so many. So this was a flow I created, and you mentioned, merging paths. This is not using auto layout, as you can see. I'd use this free-form layout just because, maybe I'm old school and like this one better. But I have this decision that has a bunch of different outcomes based on, getting information from these couple of records first, and I do decision based on that information, and then I come back together. So I've merged back into another element. So all we're doing is just dragging the, I'll just take this off so you can see what this looks like. This is basically, if I didn't connect this to anything, this would be basically, it's like at the end on your auto layout. This would say, well, if I go to this path, I'm hitting this, and then I'm going to end because there's nowhere else to go. But if I just drag this element over here to this element, now I've made a connection and I'm going somewhere else. So that's why, again, I find this a little bit easier to work with. I just haven't worked with auto layout enough. I've tried it, I gave it a chance, and decided, I'm way too comfortable just being able to connect things the way I've always done it. So, not the best reason to keep doing it this way, but it is working for me. But I do find, but so you see that if I hit this decision, let's say I had a third outcome, if I didn't meet the criteria, that would actually automatically go to end, right? It would just end the flow. Anytime you hit an element where it has nowhere to go, these where you have a dot, because there's a error handling path, which you can do with, sometimes I use them, most often I don't do anything with them if I'm pretty confident it's going to work. But that's where you could do some better error handling, perhaps. If there was a failure on the get or a failure on the update, you can do, or the create, you can send them somewhere else if they get a failure. So in this case, again, I split the decision, but then I come back together because at the end, I'm still doing this account update for every record that comes through this flow. So that's it. And then, you said the copy. you have this element up here for duplicate. So first step is to highlight. So I'll come down here, and let's say I want to duplicate this entire section. I'll go ahead and hit the duplicate button, and it duplicates everything, and I can just drag it wherever I need it. And if I need to change some things, I can change some things. If I want to just work with it the way it is, I can. But usually, when you be careful cloning, because you'll need to go in and most likely you're going to have to change most of the things that are behind each of these elements.
Great. All right. George has a question. Does the selection automatically store all fields affect processing speed? In other words, would selecting only the fields you require to run your flow speed up the process?
That's a really good question. My experience is that I have pretty heavy objects. My order object, opportunity object, they're both pretty big. This thing runs in a snap. So I think Salesforce has done some pretty good things behind the scenes, so I don't have to worry about it. I have not run into any issues. I thought the same exact thing when I first saw that was available. I was like, oh man, I'm so used to defining exactly which fields I want to bring in. Then I decided to give it a chance. Hey, I did some testing and just used my larger objects and found no performance issues on my end so far.
Cool. All right, Maggie asks, what is the best way to see all your criteria and actions in Process Builder?
Good question. So Process Builder, it is not easy. So I don't have a good answer for you in that one. You have to scroll through. This is where process can be a little bit tedious. If you're working with a lot of processes or a process builder with a lot of decision elements, I find the best thing to do, and this is the only way we're able to make heads or tails of it, is to use the name and the description. Use that to tell you what that thing does. If you don't put adequate descriptions that tell you exactly what this does, you can hover over it. It tells you, see, my descriptions get kind of long because these things can do a lot of different things. So if I don't put in my description, there's no way from this layer for me to see. I could just call this anything I want. I can put anything I want in here, and it doesn't have. It won't. The only thing I'm going to know is it's tied to this object. That's all Process Builder tells you at this point. With Flow, you don't even get that. Flow doesn't have to be specific to any object. So Flow, my naming convention there is I try to say what record, what object would cause this flow to run, at least the primary one, and I'd usually start by naming it very similar to you see this. So I always put the object name hyphen and then start putting a pretty detailed description as to what triggers that process in this Process Builder, and what's happening inside that flow. Trying to put that in the name, and then if I need more information, I'll use the descriptions pretty heavily to label that out. But there's not a good way to see everything that's happening in these processes. You click into one, again, naming is key. I try to put my name here because unless I click into this, I cannot see exactly what criteria are causing this to run. But if I name it smart, when I look through it, I should know what it's doing.
Great. All right, Cassandra asks, we could limit access with permission sets. Do you have any additional information I can get to?
You have limited access to permission sets?
She's asking whether we could limit access to with permission sets.
Limit access to permission sets. Limit access with permission sets. I believe there is a way to do that. I remember seeing it probably at Dreamforce. I thought it was live. Do you know, Jennifer, if that's live for sure, the permission set? That's
are you
like a restrict access?
Are you referring to permission set groups that allow you to mute certain permissions within a permission set?
Yes, that's probably what I'm referring to.
Okay.
I frankly haven't used them very much. I know of it, but I don't have a lot of personal firsthand experience using that feature yet. But I believe it does exist, that you can mute permissions.
Yeah, so permission set groups allow you to add one or more permission sets so that if you have people of a specific role, you could assign them the permission set group that then gives them the permission of all the permission sets associated with that versus individual permission sets. So within the permission set group, there is a, one of the permissions is to mute a permission set. So let's say you have something that you installed from the App Exchange and say it provides modify all data or some elevated rights that you don't want to give your business users, but you want to give them all the other permissions within that permission set. You can go into that muting permissions and mute a specific permission within that permission set group.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for answering the question for me. That's more information than I've had myself on that. So I knew it existed, but I have not frankly used it. So I can say I've got one permission set group that we've created a while back. So I haven't touched these as much as I need to. So what else we got?
All right. So gotta just remind people, if you have any last minute questions, it could be related to Michael's presentation or any general process automation questions that you may have with the 4 minutes we have left. And let me go to the Trailblazer community just to check and see if there's anything out there.
I definitely need to get into these permission set groups, and I know I've got some places where I need to use the muting. I know I remember hearing about it at Dreamforce, and then haven't done much with it yet. So
yeah, so
there
you
it is.
scrolled by it.
Muting
Yeah.
permission. There's muting right there.
Right. There was a question about, oh, here's a new question from Neil. Missed the start, but this has been great. Thanks. How often do you run these webinars? Okay, I can answer that. So we try to run them every other Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Sometimes we work around conferences and holidays and things like that. So to get our schedule, you can go to automationhour.com. And we list all our upcoming webinars with the links for registration. And you can get that information also on our Trailblazer Community Salesforce Automation Hour. And then I thought I saw another question about how to debug record trigger flows.
Record trigger flows. Okay, good question. I have not got into debugging those. I'm not sure if there is a way to do it. I know some of there are some challenges. Some of the flows are not debuggable, which is really annoying. Although I do love this debug on Canvas. By the way, I think it's fantastic. So if you do see this available on if you create a newer flow, it definitely is available. On some of my older flows, I don't see that option yet. Probably has some elements that aren't available for use on that flow for that feature. But debug on Canvas, it shows you exactly which path that you use. So I used this to test this one today. Again, I built this thing today, and when I ran the debug on Canvas, I put in my test. You have to have a test record ID because it might, whatever your input ID is or IDs or names are, you have to have input data, whatever your input values are. And so in this case, I only had the one order ID that I had to input, pushed through it, and I ran one test where it followed this path. I ran another test that followed this path. If I had to do it fully, I should test, each of these paths in this decision element to make sure everything works. But I feel pretty confident after, seeing both of these paths work fine that I was doing really well. So again, I'm not sure about debugging certain flows you can't debug. So for example, if you pass in a record variable from Process Builder, the entire record in, which you can do like this record, is one of the variables you can pass in that passes a record variable. You can't debug those. So there are some limitations on debugging in Process Builder or in Flow rather.
Yes. So you can't run the flow debugger in a record trigger flow or a scheduled flow. You would need to run debug logs to figure out what your problem is, unfortunately.
Yes, good point. Yeah, debug logs are very handy. They're in setup. If you haven't seen them, just you go to debug. It does give you a lot of information depending on the debug level you have. You just really have to, you can look online. There's a lot of resources out there. I'm not the expert on debug logs by any means, but it's definitely a way to troubleshoot more complex issues that are plaguing you. You can see I've created a number of different trace flags over time to find different issues within my org. So definitely something you should become familiar with if you're trying to do some complex troubleshooting.
Great. And I don't see any other questions, and we're at time. So thank you, Michael, for coming back and rounding us off for the end of this year for Automation Hour.
My pleasure.
And we look forward to you coming back possibly next year.
Absolutely. I'll look at my calendar, and everybody have a happy holiday season and happy new year.
Yeah. Happy holidays, everybody. We'll see you in 2021. Bye.
Bye-bye.